introduce both of them, Rick Gibbons from the University of Connecticut and Michelle Stock from George Washington University. Both of them, along with Meg Girard, have been doing work on dual process models of health behavior for over a decade now, especially applied to understanding adolescent and young adult health risk behavior. I'm glad they've been able to join our group because I think there's a lot of room for applying dual process models to understanding health behavior, and Rick and Michelle have done probably some of the most groundbreaking work in this area. And I know that both Rick and Michelle have put together a presentation of some of their work, but would be happy to make this more of a discussion or conversation with you all. So they're happy to take questions during the talk, and there should also be some time during the second half of the hour for a little bit more discussion. So without any further ado, please welcome Rick and Michelle to our Social Personality and Health Network virtual brown bag. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, John, and thank you for organizing this. This is a great service to the area and people who are interested. I'm really pleased that you're doing this and pleased that you invited us to go ahead and participate. So let me start by kind of telling people what we're going to. I'm sorry?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Let me start by just giving you an outline of what the talk, what the webinar is going to entail. I'm going to start by introducing dual processing models, models of health behavior. I'm going to do both of those fairly quickly. I'm assuming that people, this group anyway, people are probably quite familiar with dual processing and also with health behavior models. So I won't spend a lot of time on that. Then I'll talk a little bit about our dual processing model, the prototype willingness model that I'm assuming some are familiar with, but probably, I'm sure not everyone. Present a couple of findings that illustrate some basic elements of the model, and then turn it over to Michelle. And Michelle will present a series of studies that she's conducted over the last few years, looking primarily at one type of heuristic involved in health behavior, and that's the absent-exempt heuristic. And she'll define that, and as I said, talk a little bit about some of the studies that she's conducted that examine the absent-exempt heuristic and also look at how it can be applied to different types of health behavior. As you can see, our email addresses are up there on the first slide, and so by all means, we're more than willing to send reprints or preprints or what. Okay, hopefully this will work okay. I'm the wizard here, so I'm going to be the one controlling this, and then basically when I turn it over to Michelle, she's going to, Michelle, why don't you just say next or whatever to get me to move on, okay?
Okay.
All right. So theories of health behavior, and as I said, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. The majority of theories of health behavior have involved some version of what I would call the expectancy value perspective, which, as I'm sure most of you know, posits that all health behavior is intentional, and the result of a decision-making process that involves consideration of behavioral options, consideration of some of the consequences that might be associated with different types of possible actions, which can lead to an intention to engage or not engage, which then can lead to the actual behavior. And this type of perspective, I think, has been extremely effective in predicting certain types of behaviors. And I have up there a few examples of probably the best known of these theories. Of course, the health belief model, theory of reasoned action, the theory of planned behavior. And they have worked for many years very well at predicting a number of health behaviors. For example, exercise, good nutrition, screening, flossing, contraceptive use. There are a number of them that all involve some kind of reasoning. They don't work as well for behaviors that arguably are not typically or oftentimes not pre-planned. So, for example, driving under the influence, seldom have planned to drink and drive. They may do it under some circumstances and can actually tell you that they might be willing to do it under circumstances, but they seldom have that as a particular goal state or for unprotected sex. And as far as groups that do use groups for which the expectancy value perspective does not apply as well, that would be kids relative to adults. So there's room for improvement, and that has led a number of researchers in the area to turn to social cognition and cognitive psychology and borrow some of the elements of dual processing models that have been around for a while in cognitive psychology. And there are quite a few of them. They go by different names, and they have those examples would be Valerie Rayna's fuzzy trace theory, reflective impulsive model of Fritz Bach. We borrowed a lot from Epstein's cognitive experiential self theory. All of these approaches are based upon one primary assumption, and from which the name of the approach was derived, and that is an assumption that there are two types of processing of information, incoming information, that exist more or less simultaneously, and so when it comes to health decision making, both types of processing systems can and often are involved. As kind of an illustration, I've borrowed from Matt Lieberman's 2002 Advances chapter where he lays out the reflective reflexive model, and I'm going through this quickly. These are some of the characteristics, first of all, of the X system, the reflexive system. Automatic processing, done quickly. Learning is based upon repeated trials. In contrast, the reflective system, or the C system, processing is more controlled. It's relatively slow, and learning in that system is based upon symbolic logic. Okay. Our model is a little bit different than most. There is a modification that distinguishes our model somewhat from other models. I'm not going to really go into a lot of detail on that. The basic difference is that our contention is that processing is not just either automatic or controlled, but rather there are different degrees of heuristic processing. So we focus more on type of processing, specifically analytic versus heuristic processing. Those are the terms or the labels that we use, and how those different types of processing can lead to different types of health decisions and eventually health behavior. Okay, so in terms of general characteristics of the heuristic versus analytic system, basically relative to the analytic processing system, heuristic system is much more intuition-based as opposed to reason-based, which is characteristic of the analytic system. More affect has more of an impact on heuristic processing, whereas cognition influences the analytic processing system more. Heuristic system more image-based, and I'll talk about images in just a minute, as opposed to more rule-based among the analytic, within the analytic processing system. Social influence has more impact on heuristic processing as opposed to cognitive influence in the analytic system. And then finally, and important to our model, the heuristic system tends to be more reactive, less planful, whereas the analytic system is more reasoned. Okay, an example of dual processing applied to health. I've used this example a number of times. I think it works nicely. This is a construct that is found in virtually all theories or models of health behavior, and that's perceived risk. Typically, the question would be asked in a form that would activate or instantiate, whatever term you want to use, analytic processing. So you ask somebody, for example, how dangerous is it to have many drinks, 5 or 6 drinks, and then drive? And the response that you're likely to get to that kind of question is more analytic. It's somewhat more detached. And it turns out that the response to that kind of question is associated with behavioral intention, which I can't see on my screen because of the box for the webinar, but I'm assuming it's there. Hopefully it's there.
It's there.
On the other hand, heuristic processing would be activated by a different type of question that many of you will recognize if you're familiar with Neil Weinstein's work. If you were to engage in this behavior, what are the chances that negative consequence might actually happen to you? So it's a kind of conditional vulnerability, and Michelle will give some examples of that a little bit later on. The response that you get to that is less analytic and often produces examples of what Neil Weinstein called optimistic bias, or as Michelle will talk about, absent exempt. And in both instances, it's basically a perception that I'm at less risk than may actually be the case, or less risk than other people, what have you. Why is that the case? Well, I can't really say. I feel that way, okay? And there would be a number of heuristics involved here as well, including bad things don't happen to good people. So Michelle, as I said, will talk more about absent exempt in just a few minutes. Okay, so our model, dual processing model of health risk, and it has a number of assumptions. These are the three primary assumptions, okay? Adolescent health behavior is often reactive rather than planned. Surveys, for example, done with young women who are pregnant. Why did you have unprotected sex? Well, I didn't really intend to do that. It just happened. And that's common for many types of health risk behaviors in adolescents, and even to some extent in adults, although less so. Much of it involves heuristic processing system, okay? And therefore, processing is limited. It tends to be quicker, and it is image-based. And I'll talk about images in just a minute. Okay, what it looks like is this, basically. I'm sure all of you recognize this, in essence, is the theory of reasoned action. It is probably the most popular, widely cited expectancy value theory. It includes attitudes and norms as more distal predictors, behavioral intention as a proximal antecedent to behavior, and of course BI in this theory of reasoned action and planned behavior is the only proximal antecedent to behavior. So that's basically where we started when we were creating the prototype model, which we created in order to improve the predictive power of the theory of reasoned action, essentially. So our model adds a few constructs. We always measure previous behavior. We're interested frequently in behavior change. We're also interested in having some measure of habit. So previous behavior is a good way to assess that. In our model, the theory of reasoned action becomes essentially the reason path, and then we have a second path, the social reaction path, which originates, or excuse me, the primary distal antecedent is prototype, which I will define in just a minute, which predicts behavioral willingness. Also, I'll define that in just a second. And willingness is also predicted by attitudes and norms. So you have, in essence, then, two pathways to health risk behavior. The reason path, which involves analytic processing, or tends to involve more analytic processing, and the social reaction path, which involves more heuristic processing, and the proximal antecedents differ. BI and BW are highly correlated, but they're not redundant, and they predict independently, as you'll see in just a minute. Okay, behavioral intention. Construct that I'm sure everyone is quite familiar with. A premeditated plan to achieve some goal state involves mostly analytic processing. The first part of this is actually taken from an earlier paper by Eisen. The idea being, Fishbein and Eisen talk about intentions as being, in essence, the amount of energy or effort one's willing to put out to achieve a particular kind of goal state. So, for example, how willing, or how, excuse me, how am I intending to quit smoking, or do I intend to lose weight, or something along those lines? Okay. Willingness, on the other hand, is an openness to risk opportunity, an unplanned response to a situation, to an opportunity, oftentimes but not always a social opportunity, more so among kids, and it involves mostly heuristic processing, and we'll kind of talk about that as we go along. Okay, prototypes, risk images. First of all, the image that an individual has of the type of person who engages in a particular behavior. So this is a typology. The type of person, for example, if you ask kids to describe the type of kid your age who uses drugs, for example, they can do that, and they have oftentimes very rich kinds of perceptions of the type of kid who does this. But that continues into adulthood as well. I think not so much. Images are very important to teenagers, but they're also important to adults as well, and they influence behavior. So an adult might have an image of the type of person who cheats on his or her income taxes, or cheats on his or her spouse, or drinks and drives, or what have you. And those images are influential when it comes to determining behavior, especially health behavior. There are also social consequences of engaging in the behavior. Kids realize that if I were to go ahead and smoke marijuana, if I were going to go ahead and get drunk, and did it in front of my peers, which is where those behaviors typically occur, then I will most likely be identified as a member of that group. I become a druggie or whatever it might be if I engage in the behavior in front of my peers. And so in some sense, the image is the social consequence of engaging in the behavior. And the final point here, which is related to that, among kids anyway, the images for the most part tend to be negative. And therefore, at least up until mid to maybe even late teens, they tend to be more inhibitory than facilitating, which is, I think, important from an intervention perspective or a preventive intervention perspective. There's something to work with there because kids don't really have strong or don't have positive images of kids that engage in unhealthy behaviors. Okay, last two slides that I have before I let Michelle take over. These are findings from a couple of papers that we published that look at basically factors influencing intentions versus willingness. And the first one, as you can see, moderation by risk opportunity. And in this particular case, the risk opportunity is mostly social risk. So what we did with a sample was to ask these kids and their parents, how many of your friends are smoking cigarettes, how many of your friends are smoking marijuana, and also how many of your peers, people at your school. And we asked both the parent and the child, the adolescent, to tell us, and then came up with a measure of social risk. Another way of looking at it, however, would be a measure of opportunity. And then basically looked at how social risk moderated the relations between intention versus willingness to engage in these different health risk behaviors, smoking, drinking, and marijuana use. And as you can see, this is with a sample of 746 African American kids from the Family and Community Health Study. They were age 11 at time 1 when we measured their intention and their willingness. And then we measured their substance use 2 years later when they were 13. So the intention was basically, do you, in the next 6 months, do you intend to smoke cigarettes? Do you intend to use marijuana? Willingness, in the next suppose sometime in the next 6 months you find yourself in the following situation. You're at a party and marijuana is available. How willing would you be to actually use marijuana? Our hypothesis was that the social context would have more of an impact on the willingness to substance use path than the intention to substance use path. And you can see here, these are the betas for the high and low risk groups. The high risk would be kids above the median in terms of friends and peers using. And you can see that the context doesn't make all that much difference. And the betas are not all that strong. That's because the vast majority of kids who reported at time 2, age 13, that they were using had said absolutely no chance that I would use earlier on. And that's not atypical for intention measures or even behavioral expectation measures at this age. In the low-risk group, the kids whose friends and peers, for the most part, are not using, you get a beta that's in the same ballpark as the intention items. There's no opportunity there, so even though the kids are willing, they don't really end up using. But if you look at the willingness to use path among kids in the high-risk groups, you can see it's pretty powerful. And in fact, the majority of kids who reported some willingness at time 1 who were in a high-risk context actually ended up using it. And they were overall in the minority. But that particular group definitely ended up using. There's another way of saying that at this particular age, basically, kids can tell us their willingness, and that willingness predicts, and it predicts better than intention up until the late teens. Okay, and then the last slide that I have before I let Michelle take over is this is looking at the effects of manipulated mood state on willingness versus intention to have casual sex, defined basically as in the next 6 months, do you intend to have sex with somebody that you've just met or don't know very well, versus suppose sometime in the next 6 months you find yourself at a party, you find someone who's very attracted to you, etc. I probably don't need to go any further. That's basically the kind of risk scenario. And then this is studied, actually one of a series of studies done by Elizabeth Pomeroy, and she manipulated mood before asking them these questions. So she put them in a happy mood or a sad mood, and then asked them either their intention or their willingness. So in essence, a 2-by-2 design. And what she found basically is a decrease, relatively speaking, in the happy condition. Her interpretation, our interpretation, is that casual sex is risky, and one is frequently less willing to take risks when in a good mood, because the risks can ruin the good mood. And if you contrast that with willingness, you have a much more pronounced effect. That these are college students, basically, and again, this was a between subjects design, so they were asked either intention or willingness, but not both. And you can see there's a highly significant interaction, and willingness was much more affected by the affect than was intention. And she has done other studies showing essentially the same thing. More generally, willingness is moved around a fair amount more than is intention, which is less responsive, more impervious to changes in affect. Okay, so I'm done. I'm going to, you ready, Michelle?
Yes.
Okay, any questions before we move on? Okay, all right, so take it over.
Okay, so as Rick mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about a few studies related with the heuristic associated with absent-exempt thinking, and then I'll also talk a little bit about a few other health-related manipulations and studies we've done that look at the two pathways related to behavioral intentions versus behavioral willingness, and health risk cognitions versus more planful behavior. So as Rick referred to earlier, absent-exempt thinking is basically it'd be considered more of a heuristic or a unique form of optimistic bias. So it's the belief held by some people that if they have not, at least yet, experienced any negative health consequences, they are unlikely to do so in the future, even though they have engaged and even continue to engage in negative health risk behaviors. So we know that experience with health risk behaviors are often negatively associated with conditional risk perceptions, especially looking at the risk behaviors that we study a lot, so behaviors that are more enjoyable or perceived as controllable, and ones that people can potentially engage in repeatedly without yet experiencing negative consequences, so such as sex or substance use and UV behaviors, as I'll talk about. But what we find is that abstinent-exempt related thinking isn't fully rational. So, for example, as risk behavior continues to increase and we find adolescents or young adults put themselves in even more risky situations, their endorsement of this abstinent-exempt related belief actually increases over time. So they decrease their risk perceptions, they increase their willingness to engage in the risk behavior. And this is even more so among, as I said, those who are at higher levels of risk already. And because it is more of a heuristic-based aspect, and we find that it is more influenced by emotions and social factors, then some of the studies I'll talk about in just a moment look at how it may also be influenced by comparison with lower risk peers who've experienced negative related health outcomes. So many, for example, public service announcements or even media portrayals, so TV shows or movies, may use the illustration, it only takes one time, or you may have seen images of peers who are technically at lower risk, but who have actually suffered the negative consequences of a behavior. So, for example, getting an STD or getting pregnant with only one sexual partner. And research shows that these illustrations aren't usually very effective at actually increasing risk perceptions or willingness. Next slide, please. So study one, and for time's sake, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail related to the measures and background information. So if you have additional questions, please feel free to ask at the end or to email me at a later time. But for the first study that I'm going to talk about, we had 175 college students, all who were non-virgins, who reported their sexual behaviors, social comparison orientation, which, again, I won't go into detail about what we did look at as a potential moderator. And also, these were students who reported not having an STD in the past or suffering negative consequences as they perceived due to their sexual experiences. And we know that health risk cognitions are more likely to be affected when there's a heuristic-based information and health information compared to more analytic-based information. So what we did is we had these students, we presented them with health-related information at a later time, so a few weeks after the pretest, and they heard from a peer who was either a lower risk or a high risk target. So the low risk comparison target was a fellow college student, same gender, who reported having either just one sexual partner and very consistent condom use, or a higher risk target who reported having 5 sexual partners and very inconsistent condom use. And in both situations, this peer reported through their discussion on health-related experiences that they had been recently diagnosed with genital herpes. So the question was, does viewing or hearing from lower risk but infected peers, so those who potentially engaged in similar or lower levels of health risk but have suffered a negative consequence, how does that actually impact risk-related cognition? Next. So this is a measure of conditional perceptions of vulnerability to getting an STD in the future. And this is controlling for their time 1 cognitions. And the group that I was most interested in were actually the higher risk participants. And risk was measured by looking at their number of sexual partners and their infrequency of condom use. And among the high-risk participants who actually heard from the lower risk target but who had suffered the negative consequence of getting an STD due to their behaviors, they actually ended up reducing their perceptions of risk for an STD in the future. Now, the slope for low-risk participants was significant, so showing that a similar risk peer actually had a positive impact, though, on their perceptions of risk. Next. And this is a measure of their willingness. So we had several scenarios where we asked them to think about their willingness to engage in unprotected sex with casual or steady partners. And what we found is that again, the group that really stuck out were the high-risk participants who heard from the lower-risk target. And we found a similar pattern with images of those who engage in similar risk behavior, so non-condom users. So this group also reported the highest levels of favorability, prototype favorability of those who engage in risky sex. So overall, these patterns of results show that the high-risk students who heard about others, their age and gender, who were actually at lower risk, but had suffered the negative consequences, whereas these students hadn't themselves, they engaged in what appeared to me more AE thinking. So they reported greater willingness, more favorable images, but lower conditional perceptions of risk. Next. So study 2 was designed to just see if we could reduce abstinent-exempt related thinking. So we designed a manipulation that was intended to actually indirectly induce a little more of analytic processing. So induce the students to rely less on the heuristic reactive pathway in response to this social-based health information. And we had 150 students, and these were all high-risk students because that was the group that I was most interested in. This was the group who was actually engaging in the abstinent-exempt related thinking in study 1. So they're all students who reported having several partners without condom and without any reported history of an STD. Once again, they were randomly assigned to hear from the target who was either lower or similar risk. And then for inducing, trying to get them to really rely more on more cognitive-based analytic thinking versus the more heuristic route, what we did is we gave all of them kind of a two-part study, and for the first part gave them some health-related information in general. So we designed it as a health-related article to read. And for half of them, there are a few statements in there telling them basically indirectly what abstinent-exempt thinking was. We related it to actually UV exposure and skin damage, and basically telling them that it's not logical to think that just because they engage in maybe a risky health behavior that if they continue to engage in that behavior, they will never experience any type of potential negative outcome. And then the control condition read the same information just without these few sentences in. Next. So as you can see, for this study, we piloted and used a 4-item abstinent-exempt related measure. And again, we controlled for their time 1 cognitions. And what we found is that with the yellow line, this is the group, the no abstinent-exempt information group. So this is basically a finding that you could map on to study 1, where we didn't actually have an abstinent-exempt measure, but what we find here is that among those who didn't get the information, we weren't trying to encourage them to think more analytically about this, they actually reported the highest levels of abstinent-exempt thinking when comparing with the low-risk targets. But we were able to reduce that effect to show that abstinent-exempt thinking is malleable. By introducing abstinent-related information, they actually reported the lowest levels of abstinent-exempt related thinking, which is more logical because they are at the highest levels of risk. Next. And then this is just a figure just for time's sake. I kind of combined a few different risk cognitions. So we found a similar pattern with willingness to engage in risky sex and with images of a casual non-condom user or prototypes of the casual non-condom user. So those who didn't receive the AE information and were confronted with a lower risk target actually had the riskiest cognitions, which would map on to and replicate study 1 findings. But those who received the AE information, once again, they had the lowest levels of risk cognitions. So in summary, what we found is that AE thinking is malleable and can reduce the negative effects of potentially engaging in more socially reactive processing in response to certain types, in particular here social-based health-related information. And we did actually do another study where we looked at binge drinking and negative health outcomes and found similar results when telling them to think in a more logical manner. Next. So for the next study, I'm actually going to talk a little bit about a study where we looked at heuristic versus analytic thinking in terms of trying to induce the pathways of processing. But here we actually included older women. So Rick focused a lot on adolescents, young adults, but we've also found that those who are more experienced with risk behavior, maybe the negative outcome is more salient for them, such as high-risk sexually active students. The heuristic processing pathway may be more likely to be activated as well. So for this study, we had 114 women between 27 and 67 years of age. They all received a UV photo. So as most of you probably know, UV photography has been shown to be very effective in reducing ultraviolet, so sun-related cognitions and behavior. And we examined the impact of encouraging the participants to either, in a third, to focus on their thoughts, cognition, so induce them to really think logically when seeing the damage that's been done to their face due to UV exposure and thinking about this. A third, we asked them to focus on their emotions, their feelings in response to the UV photograph. And then we had a control group who didn't receive either of these instructions. We were really interested in looking at how not only did this manipulation, but how the age of the participants may influence their responses to inducing these different pathways related to seeing once damage that has already been done. So along with a few graduate students of mine, so Laura Walsh and Peterson and Dr. Meg Gerard, we looked at, next slide, first absent exempt thinking related to skin cancer. And what we found is that, and with this particular analysis, we actually took out any participant, obviously, who reported having been diagnosed with skin cancer. But what we found is that, first of all, that the thoughts versus control conditions did not significantly differ. So the non-feelings group is actually the thoughts and control combined in these slides. But when you look at the feelings group in particular, not only did the feelings group overall report higher levels of absent exempt thinking, which you would predict because that's more of a heuristic-based processing, but the older women in particular reported the highest levels of absent exempt related thinking after seeing their UV photo. Next. And we also found a similar pattern with willingness to go in the sun without sun protection. So this was actually a 4-item measure. And among older women in particular, those who were asked to think with their emotions more than their thoughts or cognitive-based thinking, they actually reported the highest levels of sun risk willingness as well. Next. Now, we also looked at, since we couldn't measure actual behavior in the lab-based study, we set up a proxy for it. So we told them to take as many sunscreen packets as they wanted to on their way out the door. Now, taking sunscreen packets and actually would be considered a little more of a reasoned or planned activity. So actually planning to take them with intentions, we would assume, of hopefully using them in the future. And what we actually found here is a different pattern. So among those in the non-feelings group, so those who were instructed, either no instructions or in particular those who were told to think more logically, they actually took the highest levels, highest numbers of sunscreen packets, in particular the older women. Next. So before I start talking much about this slide, I just want to quick summarize. So what those results basically showed is that it's important to look at both pathways, so more the logical-based processing and how that can potentially impact more planful protection behaviors, as you would predict. But the emotion focus can actually potentially have negative impact on risk cognitions, especially for those who maybe the risk outcomes are more salient. And these two studies, just briefly, I'm going to mention a few results we found where we've looked at willingness versus intentions in response to health-related manipulations. So for the first study was actually a study designed by a former graduate student and a colleague of mine, Dr. Dana Litt. And for this study, students, so these were 189 adolescents between 13 and 15 years of age, they saw Facebook profiles were either 75% or 20 in total, or 25% of the profiles showed peers using and talking about alcohol use in the profiles. And what we found is that the adolescents who saw the more normative use of alcohol in the profiles, that had a significant impact on increasing their willingness to use alcohol in the future, their affective-based attitudes towards alcohol use, and their prototype or image of the typical alcohol user their age. However, we did not find a significant impact on intentions to use in the future, which once again is probably because willingness involves less reasoned, immediate processing that would be more likely to be altered by these social influence factors in comparison to more the intention-based processing. And related to the absent-exempt studies that I talked about, we've done a few other studies with sex. And overall, in all of the studies, what we find is that these peers do not have a significant impact on their intentions to engage in risky sex in the future. However, what we did find is that among the high-risk participants, in particular those who compared with the lower risk target, there was an increase in intentions to get tested for STDs. Similar to with the older women, they chose to take more sunscreen packets in the future. So showing that it is important, once again, to look at both the reason pathway, where sometimes young adults do engage more reason processing, and that may be better studied when looking at these health-related manipulations with more planful behaviors like intentions to get tested in the future. Next. So this is another study where a colleague of mine, Dr. Tanya Dodge, and Dana Litt and I actually looked at the illegal is effective heuristic among male college athletes in regards to performance-enhancing substances. So it was designed to examine if the illegal is effective heuristic, which is the belief that illegal performance-enhancing substances are more effective on physical performance compared to legal substances, are more likely to affect willingness, which we would predict compared to intention, since it is a heuristic. And as you can see here, this is what we found, that the illegal is effective heuristic had a significant impact on willingness, as did their prototype or image of the typical male athlete who uses illegal enhancing substances, whereas it did not, neither of these had a significant impact on intentions to use performance-enhancing substances in the future.
I add one thing that I realized that I didn't mention earlier, and that is that in this case, and I'm assuming that's the case, that prototype basically is the favorability of the image based upon adjectives, right?
Correct. How favorable.
Okay. Okay. Go ahead.
Next. So the last series of studies, again, I'm having to, for time's sake, just go into very brief details about these, but we've done several studies where we've looked at reactions to experiences of racial discrimination in the lab to look at the causal impact of racial discrimination, in particular among on substance use cognition. And what we found is that racial discrimination, so both the condition itself, so when we manipulate racial discrimination in labs, but also their perceptions of being discriminated against, both of these significantly impact more explicit measures of substance use, so willingness to engage in substance use behaviors in the future, but also more implicit or indirect measures of substance use cognition. So these would be measures such as word association tasks. But what we also find is that this immediate, more heuristic-based processing that you would assume is happening in this social-based scenario does not have a significant impact on intentions to use in the future. We also found that anger in all of the studies where we measured mood is the significant mediator of the impact of discrimination on substance use willingness, and that these feelings of anger, once again bringing in affect and emotion again, are more strongly correlated with willingness versus intentions to engage in substance use behaviors in the future. So, Rick, I'm not sure if you wanted to go on to SAFE or if we.
No, I think we're at a stopping point. There are 2 slides on interventions which I could do, but it's what looks like 47 after the hour. So maybe, John, do you have any suggestions? Should we stop here and take questions, or?
Yeah, actually, we can stop for a couple minutes if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask now. Why don't you go ahead? If you happen to be muted, let me know and I'll unmute you. Otherwise, shoot. And also, please introduce yourself if you have a question. Okay, actually, we have I believe it's a question from Andrew Ward, who asks that seems like self-affirmation might be effective at reducing some of the absent exempt beliefs. Do either of you do any work or think about any connections between self-affirmation and some of the things that you're looking at?
Well, we've done studies with, I haven't done self-affirmation directly with absent exempt thinking, although it is very possible that self-affirmation could reduce some of this. But we have found that there isn't a significant impact on self-esteem or feelings about the self. So I can't say for sure that it would, but what I can say is that with the racial discrimination studies, we found that racial affirmation, so affirming one's positive feelings about the self related to their racial identity, does protect against the impact of discrimination on substance use cognition.
I think it makes sense in the sense that self-affirmation would reduce some of the need or some of the defensiveness, some of the ego protective aspect of it. So I think it does make sense. But no, we haven't done studies manipulating self-affirmation yet.
Great. Andy says that's what he was thinking. So it sounds like you guys are thinking on the same lines.
All right.
Any other questions anybody has, or would folks like to hear about some of the intervention work that Rick and Michelle are able to talk about? Why don't you speak about some of the intervention stuff?
All right. I'll go ahead and do that then. So basically, we have done several interventions ourselves, and also others have adopted different parts of our model and used them in different types of interventions. Michelle talked about one of them, which was the UV intervention that had part of its theoretical origins in the prototype willingness model. There's another intervention that it actually continues in different forms now, that was started initially by Gene Brody at the University of Georgia and his colleague Velma Murray. And it's the Strong African American Families Program. It's a dual focus intervention. And I can tell you just a little bit about it here because it uses elements of the prototype willingness model and incorporates them into this intervention that Gene Brody had developed. So the basic idea that comes out of our model as far as intervention implications is that, and Michelle said something to this effect, that one should target both paths to the behavior, both reasoned and reactive, and you'll see evidence of that in just a minute. The kids use both types of processing and will respond to both types, and in fact the combination of the two is probably best. Second point I mentioned earlier, the risk images tend to be negative, so this intervention, various forms of this Strong African American Families intervention has targeted alcohol, and the results I'll present in just a minute are from that version of it, but also drug use and unprotected sex. All of the images associated with those behaviors, as I mentioned before, are relatively negative among young kids, and it's not until they reach maybe mid-teen years, when either they and or their friends are engaging more, that you can see the favorability of the prototype of the image tends to become more positive. So there's a critical period there when you can take advantage of the negative images, which is what we did in SAFE. Another assumption in here was that images could be altered, and that a number of people have shown this, and we were able to do it effectively in this intervention. And then the final thing, which took a little bit of doing, but basically we, in the intervention, we sat down with the kids and basically discussed with them in a kind of focus group kind of setting, typically 7, 8, 9 kids. We talked, in essence, about the difference between intention and willingness. And, of course, we didn't talk about heuristic versus analytic processing, but we did talk about situations that kids find themselves in where they end up doing behaviors that they had no intention whatsoever of engaging in. And then, you know, asking them, can you envision that kind of situation, and could you envision yourself possibly doing the behavior? And it doesn't take long. These kids were 11 and 12 when they were in the intervention, for, you know, some of them anyway to say, yes, I don't intend to do it, I don't expect to do it, but I could see under some circumstances doing that. So this is one of the papers that came out of the SAFE intervention. This is Meg Gerard was the first author on this paper, published in the Psychology of Addictive Behaviors in 2006. So the intervention basically, it's a family-based intervention. The family comes and they split up, and the parents go into one room and they sit down with a facilitator, and the kids go into another room. And they do that for an hour, and then they come back for a second hour together as a family and go through things. And typically they do this once or twice a week for about 6 to 8 weeks. And so in the parent version of it, what the parents heard basically was a program that Gene Brody had developed that improves communication between parents and kids about risk, health risk basically, and ways to communicate with the kids, effective ways, and also effective ways to deal with, you know, what happens if my, you know, 13-year-old comes home and I smell alcohol on his breath or something like that. And that's been shown to be very effective. So the intervention improved the kids' reporting of the parents' effectiveness and also the parents' self-reporting. That, in turn, had an impact on the kids' intention. And there's a bottom half to this you'll see in just a minute. You need the whole picture, I think, to understand it. But that had an impact on the kids' intention, which ultimately delayed increases in alcohol. And this is between approximately ages 11 and 13. The intervention when they were 11, and then the outcome when they were 13, about, I think, 26, 27 months later. So basically then, the parent part of the program targeted the reason pathway, and then of course we had another part that targeted the social reaction pathway, and that's where we talked with the kids again, with the facilitator. They talked about the images that they have of kids that drink, which tend to be relatively negative, and became more negative over time, sort of a social norm approach, where they learn that other kids, in fact, don't have favorable images either. And so basically the normal trajectory of increasing favorability of the prototype was delayed. That was associated, once again, I mean, between 11 and 13, everything goes up. I mean, the prototype favorability typically goes up, willingness goes up, intention goes up. So the object is to try and delay that increase. And sure enough, we were able to do it. And so the change in prototype mediated the effect of the intervention on willingness, and then willingness changes in willingness predicted drinking as well. And you can see when both paths are in there, then the willingness to intention pathway is stronger and the other one drops out. However, the model fit is better with both pathways in there and both intention and willingness. So the bottom line here is that targeting both types of processing, heuristic and analytic, appears to be most effective. And other versions of SAFE with other substances and risk behaviors have shown essentially the same thing. So That's it. As I said, there are other interventions that in many regards look similar to this, but that's basically it, and that's the take-home message, I think, as far as interventions are concerned. So I'm done. Any questions? I guess we have about 3 or 4 minutes.
All right. Anybody has any questions? Feel free to speak up, introduce yourself, or shoot any questions in the chat box in front of you. Well, I have one question. I'm curious. One of the assumptions of the prototype willingness model is that some of these paths are especially powerful among adolescents and young adults. Have you ever sort of explicitly tested that idea or thought about, I guess, applying the prototype willingness model more so to adults as a way of explaining, some of those gaps that you even see in adults where, people's intentions break down and people are doing things that they don't actually expect themselves to do or intend to do?
Sure. Well, first of all, we have a study. Elizabeth Pomeroy is the first author that was in PSPB. I think it was in 2009. That actually looked at the relative predictive power of intention versus willingness in a series of studies over time in a panel study with 6 waves of data. And what you find basically, and she has a nice graph in there that shows that initially what happens basically is very few kids are intending or willing to use. Willingness becomes, this is for smoking, and then she replicated it with drinking. And then over time, willingness gives way to intention as the behavior becomes more intentional. And at some point, if a kid's drinking regularly, it would, you ask him or her, and he will say, yes, I intend to drink and I expect to drink. So usually by late teens, for these kinds of risk behaviors that we study, willingness gives way in terms of relative predictive power to intention, but it never goes away completely. We have run studies with adults. Generally speaking, for these kinds of behaviors, we find that intention consistently predicts better than willingness. There are some kinds of behaviors, as I mentioned before, where that's less the case. The only one we've really looked at is extramarital sex, but the others that I've suggested where behavior could be willingness-based would be, cheating on one's income tax. The example that we typically give is you got your return back from the CPA, and you can see that he or she made a mistake, but do you go ahead and submit it as is or not? Another example would be you get the bill at the restaurant, and they clearly made a mistake in your favor. What do you do? And it turns out that you can predict those kinds of behaviors with willingness measures, even though virtually no one says I intend to cheat on very few people. I intend to cheat on my income tax, or I intend to see if I can rip off a restaurant. So there are elements of willingness that continue into adulthood. It is also the case that the image continues to be important. Many people will say, no, I would never, commit adultery because I'm not that kind of person. So, the images continue to be influential as well. But the model was originally intended to focus on adolescents, largely for the reasons I mentioned earlier. For some behaviors, it works reasonably well with adults, but generally speaking, it works better with adolescents.
Great. Thanks, Rick. Any other questions from anybody else? Anybody? All right, well, it looks like we're right at just about 2 o'clock here, so I want to thank you, Rick. Thanks, Michelle, for taking the time out of your schedules to contribute to this virtual brown bag. I definitely found it to be really informative. Hopefully, you all did as well. Hopefully, everybody will see you soon in New Orleans at the Health Free Conference at SPSB. I think if you haven't registered yet, I'm sure I believe there might be some still space available. And happy holidays to everybody. Thanks for joining, and we'll hope to see you at the next virtual brown bag. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.